5 machines. That is how many lithography scanners one Shanghai company plans to build this year. 5. And on July 27th, that number knocked 22% off the companies that make the tools that make AI chips. Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA, Tokyo Electron, ASML. All of them. Here is the part almost nobody covered. The sell-off also hit China's own toolmakers, just as hard. And 4 days later, the earnings landed and the whole thing reversed. This is a deep dive into what actually happened to the chip equipment complex between July 23rd and August 4th, what an immersion scanner really is, and why the tape told a completely different story from the headline. Start with the trigger, because the sourcing matters. On Monday, July 27th, the information reported that state-backed enterprises in Shanghai had started mass-producing immersion deep ultraviolet lithography machines. The next day, Reuters named the manufacturer, Shanghai Aishengna Electronic Technology Group, a company incorporated in August 2023 with registered capital of 7 billion yuan, roughly $1 billion. It had absorbed engineering teams from other Chinese firms, including a startup called Shanghai Yuliangsheng. The reported targets were small and specific. About 5 systems in 2026. About 20 in 2027. First deliveries to SMIC, Huahong Semiconductor, and the memory maker CXMT. Now the tape, and every number here comes from market data I pulled myself. On July 27th, ASML closed down 5.8%. And at its intraday low, it was down 8% from Friday's close. That matches what the wires reported. But the 27th was not the damage. The damage came over the next 2 sessions. Measure from the July 23rd close to the July 29th close, and you get the real picture. ASML fell 14.0%, from $1,803 to $1,550.69. And here is the detail that reframes the entire story. The Dutch company whose monopoly was supposedly under threat fell the least. Over those same 4 sessions, Applied Materials fell 22.4%. KLA fell 22.2%. Lam Research fell 21.1%. And Tokyo Electron, in Tokyo, fell 24.2%, from 65,950 yen to 50,000 even. None of those 4 companies makes a lithography scanner. Not one. They make deposition tools, etch tools, and inspection systems. The market sold the entire toolmaking complex, and it sold the non-lithography names hardest. To be fair to the market, 2 other things were happening in that window. In Tokyo, the Nikkei fell more than 4% to a 2-month low, with August options settlement approaching and index-heavy semiconductor names like Advantest and Tokyo Electron especially exposed to short selling. And in the United States, it was the peak of chip equipment earnings week. But the sector signal is unambiguous. Over those same 4 sessions, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index fell 15.4%, while the S&P 500 fell 1.2%. This was not a market event. It was a sector event. So what is the machine everyone is pricing? An immersion deep ultraviolet scanner works like this. A laser produces light at 193 nanometers. That light passes through a mask carrying the circuit pattern, then through a lens stack, and prints the pattern onto a silicon wafer coated in photoresist. The immersion part is the trick that saved the industry in the mid-2000s. You fill the gap between the final lens and the wafer with ultra-pure water instead of air. Water has a higher refractive index, so the effective numerical aperture goes up, and you resolve finer features with the exact same light source. No new wavelength required. The Chinese system is designated SSA 800. Reported specifications: 28 nanometer class features in a single exposure, throughput around 150 wafers per hour, and roughly 70% domestically sourced components. Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment, the long-standing state lithography champion, transferred the SSA 800 technology to Yuliangsheng in 2025. SMIC has been testing an immersion system from that lineage since September 2025. So this is not a machine that appeared out of nowhere last week. It is a program that has been visible for the better part of a year. Now the coordinate that matters most, and it is the one the headline skipped. Asia Times placed the SSA 800 against ASML's TWINSCAN NXT1950i, a tool ASML launched in 2008, and put the gap at roughly 4 generations, calling the performance equivalent to an ASML machine from 15 years ago. And there is a live dispute about whether it is even in production. The Chinese industry outlet IC Smart, citing a source at a domestic foundry, said the SSA 800 had not yet entered a commercial wafer fab and appeared to still be in testing at Shanghai's Integrated Circuit Research and Development Center. Can 28-nanometer optics make advanced chips? Technically, yes, through multipatterning. You expose the same layer multiple times with offset patterns to get features finer than one pass allows. That is how SMIC reportedly reached 7-nanometer class parts. But multi-patterning multiplies exposure steps, multiplies etch and deposition steps, multiplies the chances of a defect, and destroys throughput and yield economics. Every extra pass is another opportunity for overlay error. This is exactly why the extreme ultraviolet machine exists in the first place, and extreme ultraviolet remains entirely outside China's reach. Then the earnings arrived, and they arrived within 48 hours of the panic. On July 29th, after the close, Lam Research reported the quarter ended June 28th. Revenue of $6.72 billion against a $6.65 billion consensus. Diluted earnings of $1.82 against $1.68 expected. For the full fiscal year, record revenue of $23.2 billion and diluted earnings per share of $5.82, up 41% from fiscal 2025. This was the same company the market had just marked down 21%. The guidance was the louder signal. Lam guided the September quarter to $8.1 billion, plus or minus $400 million. And management raised its view of 2026 wafer fab equipment spending to the low $150 billion range, up from a prior outlook around $140 billion. Their words for the industry were meaningfully undersupplied, with 8 to 10 new fabs coming online between now and the end of next year. The next morning, Lam opened at 318.29 against the previous close of 252.35, a 26% gap. It finished the day up 18%. Applied Materials rose 15%. The next day, Tokyo Electron confirmed it from the other side of the Pacific. Its first quarter of fiscal 2027 delivered record quarterly revenue of 732.3 billion yen. It sharply raised its first-half forecast. It set a record interim dividend of 384 yen per share, and it continued a buyback capped at 150 billion yen. So within 72 hours of a sell-off justified by 5 Chinese machines, the 2 largest non-lithography toolmakers on Earth reported record results and raised their outlooks. Both things were on the tape in the same week. So who is actually exposed? Not who the tape punished, but who the numbers say. Start with the direct question. How much revenue could 20 Chinese tools actually take? JP Morgan ran it. If China sources 20 domestic tools next year, that removes roughly 1.4 billion euros from ASML sales, about 2.4% of projected group sales. For context, ASML's second quarter alone, reported on July 15th, was 9.3 billion euros in net sales, 54% gross margin, 2.918 billion euros of net income, and the company raised full-year 2026 guidance to 43 to 45 billion euros. Analysts were blunt about the gap between building a tool and running a fleet. Sandeep Deshpande of JP Morgan said producing a handful of immersion tools is not the same as producing tools usable for high-volume manufacturing, and that yield, overlay, throughput, and reliability over thousands of wafer runs are what matter. Paul Triolo of DGA Albright Stonebridge put it this way: producing machines of the complexity of DUV immersion lithography that are commercially viable and running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for an entire year, is very difficult. Semi-analysis added the economics point. A new Chinese tool has to compete against fully depreciated ASML machines already sitting on fab floors. Now the mirror test, and this is the number I have not seen anyone else run. If this news genuinely broke a Western monopoly, China's own equipment champions should have ripped higher. They did the opposite. Nora Technology, China's largest domestic toolmaker, closed at 770 yuan on July 27th and at 641.30 on August 3rd, down 16.7%. AMEC, the etch specialist, went from 399.77 to 309.85, down 22.5%, essentially the same as Applied Materials. The alleged winners were sold as hard as the alleged losers. And the real competitive map has two other players that have nothing to do with Beijing. Nikon, under new leadership, has said publicly it intends to undercut ASML on price in argon fluoride immersion lithography, using in-house manufacturing for a cost edge. Canon is pushing NanoImprint, its FPA 1200 and Z2C system, which stamps rather than projects, reaches a 14-nanometer minimum line width, and reportedly costs around $60 million at roughly 100 kilowatts, against about $150 million and around a megawatt for an extreme ultraviolet tool. Nikon fell 15% in this window too. Canon fell 6.5%. Here is what I think this episode actually revealed, and it is not about China. It is about how thinly the market understands its own supply chain. A headline about lithography took 22% off companies that do not make lithography tools, and it took the same 22% off the Chinese companies that would benefit if the headline were true. That is not a repricing of competitive position. That is a liquidity event in a crowded sector, and it tells you how much of the AI trade is now held by people who cannot distinguish an etcher from a scanner. The second thing it revealed is that the export control story has already largely played out in the numbers, quietly, before any of this. ASML's China business was around 16% of net sales in the first half of 2026, against periods where it ran far higher. Lam's China revenue fell to 26% of the June quarter from 34% in the March quarter, with multinational fabs in China growing while domestic customers pulled back, and Taiwan hitting a record 27%. Applied Materials has guided China toward the mid-20s from levels near 40% in earlier years. The decoupling that the market panicked about on July 27th had been underway on the income statements for 2 years. So what should you actually watch, and where does the tape stand right now? As of the August 4th close, the American names had essentially round-tripped. Lam at 316.82, less than 1% below its July 23rd level. Applied Materials at 549.50, down 2.4%. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index within 1% of where it started. But two names did not come back. ASML closed at 1716, still 4.8% below. And KLA closed at 196.32, still 10.2% below. KLA is the inspection and metrology company with the highest China revenue share of the group. The market kept a discount on exactly one thing: China exposure. 3 concrete things to track from here. First, verification. The single most important unresolved fact is whether an SSA 800 is running production wafers in a commercial fab, not a research center. Watch for SMIC, Huahong, or CXMT to confirm acceptance, and watch for the IC Smart dispute to resolve one way or the other. Second, the throughput and overlay data. 150 wafers an hour is a specification, not a fleet average. The number that decides this is uptime across thousands of runs, and that data will take quarters to appear, not weeks. Third, the demand side, because that is what actually reversed this sell-off. Semi projects 300mm fab equipment spending to rise 18% to $133 billion in 2026 and to $151 billion in 2027, the first time the industry crosses $150 billion in a year. Against that, 5 tools in 2026 is a rounding error. The honest framing is this: China building its own immersion scanner is a supply-independent story on a multi-year clock. It is not, on the evidence available today, a demand story for anyone's next 4 quarters. Nothing here is investment advice, and I am not predicting where any of these stocks go. So to close the loop, 5 reported machines, 4 generations behind, 1 disputed production claim, and a 22% drawdown that hit the alleged winners and the alleged losers with equal force before reversing almost entirely in 4 sessions. The lithography story is real and it is slow. The sell-off was fast and, on the evidence, mostly wrong about who it was punishing. Everything here comes from the Information and Reuters reporting, company filings and press releases from ASML, Lam Research, and Tokyo Electron, and market data I pulled and verified myself. If this is the level of detail you want on the AI supply chain, subscribe. This has been AI Daily.